Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Programme at the Chatham House think tank. Expert on the Russian military, UATV English, is about to ask you some questions, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Pleasure to have you with us. I have a lot of questions. First, North Koreans fighting and dying for Russia in Ukraine. What does it mean? I mean, we're observing now how the Kremlin is attempting to solve the problem with largely unpopular domestic military draft, maybe.
Possibly, yes. Although, of course, this is in some ways seen as a dramatic new development. In other ways, of course, it's just another increment in this long progression that we've seen of Russia looking to its coalition partners, its fellow rogue states for support, and that support gradually pushing the boundaries of more and more being provided to Russia to help it prosecute its war effort. We've seen, for example, the expansion of weapon systems that are being supplied by Iran. We've seen now the supply of support from North Korea expanding from shells to apparently engineering troops and then ground troops, although it has to be said there is very, very little detail about exactly what this North Korean presence in Russia on the front lines actually is. And so a lot of people are speculating at this point about precisely what shape this is taking.
Well, yeah, while there indeed little detail or maybe no detail at all, but what I can see is that autocrats and dictators are actually getting along with each other, and you can form a unity way faster than democracy is doing. Is that right?
It does seem that way. Of course, we shouldn't overstate the extent to which dictators get along with each other, because the history of the 20th century shows that they cannot actually trust each other fully. But they certainly have a shared interest. And that shared interest, of course, is in challenging the West, disrupting the West, challenging the rules-based international order, and creating a world where aggression pays. And in that, of course, they are all absolutely united.
All right. So, okay, well, let's leave this. It's a topic on an absolutely separate discussion. But say long-range weapons restriction is lifted like tomorrow. Ukraine delivers its message to Russia by wiping off the face of the earth its military air bases deep in Russian territory. Do you believe that Putin will go nuclear?
No, absolutely not. And this is something that we've studied at length and published all of our findings in terms of the research of what Russia genuinely thinks about use of nuclear weapons as opposed to what it portrays to the rest of the world. Now, we wrote a long and detailed report published back in March of last year, March 2023, called Russian Nuclear Intimidation, at how it shapes Western behavior. Now, just over the last 2 days, we have reviewed the findings from that 18 months ago to see if anything has actually changed. And the conclusions were that despite all of the news that hits the headlines in Western media, there is not actually any fundamental change to the baseline probability of when Russia might resort to nuclear use. Instead, what we see is a slightly more subtle and a slightly more skillful way in which Russia has found to push those same buttons, to excite Western media and thereby to put the pressure on Western governments. But fundamentally, nothing has changed.
Right, so, you know, just fears of escalation are just fears of escalation. But on a scale 1 to 10, I know that I am speculating right now, Mr. Giles, but on a 1 to 10, how exhausted Russian army you think it is?
That, unfortunately, is one of those things which it is impossible to quantify, even if you have the detailed knowledge and detailed fundamental counting the numbers, looking at exactly what is happening to the Russian armed forces, which people in my position who take a much longer range view don't actually have. But when an army cracks, of course, is something that is very hard to tell, because if you could tell precisely when this was, then armies would never crack, because the people who manage them would know precisely when the point is when they can no longer sustain the operations they're engaged in. Now, the Russian army over time has repeatedly fallen apart and run, but when exactly that point comes is something that's impossible to tell. The one thing that we have consistently seen over history is that it takes longer than any armed force that's generated by a Western liberal democracy would take. And that goes, of course, for Russian society as well. The extent of the slide backwards in terms of living standards, the privations, the suffering of people in Russia always goes on for far longer than is expected from the outside world. But then, of course, when it finally cracks, the crack is sudden and dramatic.
You mean the demise of the Soviet Union, probably?
for example. But then let's not forget the demise of the Soviet Union was just the third time during the 20th century that the same process had repeated, that Russia had spent itself into state collapse in pursuit of a war that it could not and should not win. Whether it's the Russo-Japanese War, the First World War, finally the Cold War, the process was the same over and over again. And that may be what we are seeing now at the moment. Russia, again, spending itself beyond its capacity to actually maintain what it's doing until there is a point when, again, the system cracks.
Thank you so very much for your answer. And let's slide to another question. The other side of the previous one, I believe, Kursk incursion is obviously, it looks to me, that is a hybrid political and military operation. For how long Ukrainians should be holding on to Russian turf and why?
Well, the answer is the same for any operation of this kind, for as long as it brings greater benefits than it actually costs. And that, of course, is something that has to be evaluated on an ongoing basis as the situation evolves. The immediate benefits that came from that Kursk incursion, of course, are still ongoing. It does provide this safety zone. It does distract Russian troops. It does mean that operations on some other sectors of the front are relatively passive because those Russian forces have been withdrawn. Now, if that is worth the costs of maintaining that Kursk salient, then yes, of course, it makes sense to continue doing so. Now, outside Ukraine, of course, there was one other anticipated benefit from this that has not materialized. There was an expectation that this would demonstrate, finally, that all of the so-called red lines that Russia has set, all of the fears over escalation were in fact misplaced, because here is somebody moving onto Russian territory, and even that does not produce the kind of escalation that everybody's so feared. Now, that, of course, has been conclusively demonstrated, but it hasn't actually helped shift the calculus within the United States.
And what can? I mean, what is the fear of escalation? How many people and children should die in Ukraine before you call it, all right, this no more. This escalation is not acceptable. What should happen?
Well, the problem we have, of course, is that, say, a year ago, you could point to the fear of escalation, the fear of what Russia would do, as being one of the major factors that appeared to be constraining the United States. Now, if anything, the situation is even worse, because the United States is not only constrained, but also distracted. There are other problems around the world which it seems to be treating as a more serious and more immediate challenge than the future of Europe. And we can see how that plays out if we compare, for example, US actions in defense of Israel compared to in defense of Ukraine. And so many things that the United States and the coalition that it leads have done to protect Israeli citizens that they absolutely refused to do for Ukraine. Even in terms of protecting international shipping, this international coalition that was mobilized to keep the Red Sea open sometime after Ukraine, of course, was supposed to clear the Black Sea under its own resources and only on a base of its own strength, despite the fact that the challenge to international commerce was precisely the same. And you could go on. There are so many examples where the double standards that have been applied to the United States show very clearly that their priorities are not in Europe. Take, for instance, the way that Iranian drone manufacturers are sanctioned after their drones are used to attack Israel, despite the fact that for a year previously they had been attacking Ukraine. And the only possible logical conclusion from that is that the United States is perfectly fine with Iranian drones killing women and children as long as they're not Israeli women and children.
Absolutely. Unfortunately. Well, okay. If the war is put on hold for whatever reason that happens, some agreements should be signed. So do you believe that Russia will not go further and will hold on to these promises and agreements, whatever that will be?
Of course not. Nobody believes that. I think the recognition has grown even among those people who were most in favor of calling a halt to the fighting because that's better than fighting on, that Russia, under any circumstances, will not be trusted to adhere to a ceasefire agreement. And even more so now that you have this growing recognition across Europe that Russia is preparing for further attacks beyond Ukraine, there is this additional factor being built in that if you call a halt to the fighting in Ukraine itself, then that means that the Ukrainian armed forces are not attriting, not gradually destroying Russia's armed forces, which means that Russia itself can rebuild its forces faster and make the next attack, whether that is in Ukraine itself or somewhere else. So the fashion for calling for a ceasefire, a negotiated settlement that we've heard through various phases of the conflict of Russia's aggression on Ukraine is now subsiding slightly because the recognition of precisely what that would mean and how dangerous that situation would be is permeating further across Europe.
And the last question for today: do you really believe the Russian army is powerful and mighty enough to have that big front line? I mean, to have an ongoing war with Ukraine and with NATO, because, as you said, is actually triggering some events that could be called the big front line in NATO and Ukraine. Is that possible for Russian army to hold on?
Well, unfortunately, the question is not so much whether objectively measured Russia is capable of doing something. The question is whether within the Kremlin itself, they convince themselves that Russia is capable of doing something. Because Russia and its decision makers can be wildly wrong about their appreciation of their own capabilities and the situation in the rest of the world and launch an action which is utterly misguided and disastrous, as in February 2022. But the people who are in the path of that aggression still suffer precisely the same, whether Russia is totally correct or whether it's completely misguided. And that's the situation that we need to guide against. Russia once again convincing itself that the time to act is now, because we see how disastrous that is and how calamitous for ordinary people.
Indeed it is. Thank you so very much, first of all, for your passion and for your time and for your expertise. I would love to talk to you again when you have time. I have a lot of questions for you, Mr. Giles.
No doubt. There's a lot to talk about. Thank you.
Really, indeed. Thank you so very much. We talk soon. Goodbye. It was Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Programme and the Chatham House think tank, and experts on the Russian military at UATV English Studio. Well, that was it for tonight. Thank you so very much for your time. We appreciate that a lot. It was me, Henry Keane, and my team at UATV English. We did our best to administer at least some truth in easy terms for you out there in the world of freedom directly from Ukraine. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Your voice matters as it helps Ukrainian voice to be heard worldwide. Stay safe and tune for more tomorrow. Goodbye.